over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Kev. The video seemed to show for me, so you might want to check and see exactly what was showing there and what wasn't. But yes, welcome
Oh,
everybody.
good.
So
That's my machine causing trouble. Sorry.
there's always one machine, isn't there? So my name's Al. So I'm a technical architect in something called the Microsoft Technology Center. I've been a consultant for many, many years, covering a wide variety of Microsoft technologies. And now I kind of specialize. Well, I say specialize, but I cover quite a lot of things. So modern work, productivity, employee experience, bit of compliance, bit of Power Platform, former MVP. And I guess all of those things kind of contribute to what I'm going to talk about today. I also run the Microsoft 365 security and compliance user group, and along with Kevin, Gary, and Louisa, do the Grey Hat Beard Princess podcast as well. So where do I work? I work in Microsoft. I work in the Microsoft Technology Center in London. We are a global program of work that supports the clients for Microsoft. So we are basically doing high-end pre-sales, trying to work out how clients can actually use technology. We are global. We deal with the biggest clients, so we do get some really interesting conversations, and in particular, things around Viva. So Viva's been something that we've talked about for a long, long time in terms of how does it work, but we also have a lot of questions that lead us into that conversation about Viva, starting from different areas. So, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today in terms of how have we started the conversation around Viva and what kind of lead in do we get, and who do we speak to as well. So I think the first thing is product bingo is bad. I don't like product bingo. The reason being is that if we're trying to sell a product, that's great. We're kind of selling it and we're saying, product A costs this much, product B costs something else. But actually, really, when we're talking about employee experience, we're talking about employees. And most of the time, they're not really thinking about these products as discrete elements. They're not thinking about, okay, when do I go to goals? When do I go to insights? They're thinking about when do I actually look at what my OKRs are? How do I get insights into what I'm actually working on? What is my mandatory learning that I need to do? So they're thinking about it more from a capability perspective and not just thinking about it purely from the products. Now, that being said, um, Viva is quite good actually in comparison to many other of the product ranges in that actually the names that have been chosen really describe the capabilities quite effectively. So if you try and talk about it without mentioning the product names, it actually is quite difficult. But when we think about it as capabilities, that's really where we always want to start. The other thing about this is depending on the level of the audience that you're talking to, products are going to be less relevant to them. So, as I said, employees, but also the higher up you get, the less understanding there's going to be about specific products. It's going to be more about what are the capabilities, what is the impact that these tools are going to have on the organization. So, generally, I try and stay away from talking about specific products. So, in terms of planning, we're going to cover off a bit about each of these areas. So how do we start a conversation? What do we have to cover? So what do we need to actually make sure that we include in those conversations? Importantly, who should we be talking to? And obviously the what do we cover changes depending on who we're going to be talking to. And what are we going to talk about to each of those people, each of those different audiences? And then what outcomes are we trying to achieve? And it's really important to understand what outcomes we're trying to achieve when we think about how we frame the whole conversation. Because there's no point talking about, oh, well, we're going to implement something and, what switches do we switch on and off if we're going to be talking about an employee who really wants to understand how is this going to impact my daily life. So we really need to think about the who and the what outcomes and really frame everything in between around that. So when we think about how it's really interesting because for us in the Microsoft Technology Center, clients come to speak with us about all sorts of different things. So we will very often have clients who come to us asking specifically about Viva, but often we'll have them coming to us going, how do we use the products that we've got? How do we become more productive? So there's lots of different problems that will trigger a need for us. And often when we're speaking with clients, we will uncover different needs that they haven't necessarily identified or clarified, what Microsoft can offer. So therefore, we're looking at different problems and we're looking at how do they actually lead us into a conversation. So, where we talk about um, employees leaving, that might lead us into well-being challenges. Are employees suffering from well-being challenges? Are they working effectively? Do they have the information that they need? And all of those kind of trigger a conversation that can lead us into the Viva conversation. And all of the time, we're looking at this from an employee perspective. We're looking at it from how do we make sure employees are really engaged and they are working as effectively and as easily as possible. When we look at the numbers, we always like to use the work trend index, use the numbers that come out, the research that Microsoft have done in order to trigger these conversations. So, where we look at these, we're often trying to plant the seed that actually there are good reasons to invest in different types of technology and in ways that you engage with your clients. Now, these are really interesting because when we look at, 94% of employees would stay longer at a company that prioritize their development. This is often really hard for an organization to actually enumerate internally alone. They need more of that industry view of the world, or just generally, what are employees doing? How are they actually moving jobs? So this is where, when we do look at the work trend index and the research that drives these numbers, we're not looking at a particular industry. We're not looking at a particular organization. We're looking more generally at, we've got all of this data. How can we actually crunch these numbers to really kind of come up with tangible impact that organizations on their own wouldn't be able to get? So 94% of employees, absolutely, that should be taken with a pinch of salt to say, actually, for my industry, for my different areas of my particular organization, those numbers will change. But at the highest level, we look at these sorts of numbers and we look at these to really trigger that conversation. Okay, you know, why would they stay longer? What does it mean to prioritize their development? How do employees feed back on how well an organization is prioritizing their development? So all of these numbers that we put up, they all trigger the conversations. So, 12 times highly engaged employees, less likely to leave a company. Greater profitability for highly engaged employees. So all of these will trigger a conversation as to what do these stats actually mean? How do they actually play out when we're actually looking at them? And what can organizations do to internally measure these and then to track those? So often when we're talking about these, we then roll into, well, what are the outcomes? Okay, well, what does success look like if we look at implementing a change in the way people work? How do we start to benchmark the current numbers versus, you know, a predicted adverse impact or trend, or a predicted increase in something, positive trend? So numbers are really key for us when we're having these conversations to spark the conversation, but then also to then work out, well, what are we actually looking for in terms of trends that we want to measure? So assuming that we've got these numbers, they spark the conversation. And we're going to focus in on different areas usually. So when we're having this conversation, we might be talking about knowledge. What information do people need in order to do their job? Um, how do we show that they are engaged and that they have the right information? And knowledge could be learning. It could be, are they doing the mandatory training that they need to do? Are they doing optional learning that will help them develop internally within their organization, develop into a new role, develop so that they're prepared for a new role in a different area of the organization? Or it could be they're trying to find information. They're trying to find information about a term that they've seen or a project that they're working on. They're trying to find the people that they need to be able to actually ask questions of. So there's lots of ways that we can talk about knowledge, but actually it combines multiple different Viva modules into it. But generally, we might have, knowledge management as an overarching topic where we bring all of that conversation together. We may talk about working together. How do people collaborate? What are the tools that they're using? What are the behaviors that they're using to collaborate? Are they effectively working together? Are they productive when they're working together? So how do they work together? Who do they have to work with as well? Communication is a big one. When we want to actually promote corporate messages, when we want to be able to communicate at a lower level, peer to peer, when we want to communicate at a team or departmental level, there's many different ways that one word of communication can actually spark the conversations. And we'll often have, when we're doing sessions in the MTC, we'll often have multiple stakeholders in the room. And sometimes just their perception of, well, what does that one word of communication mean, is often, it's going to be very different depending on their seniority, depending on their role, depending on the business unit that they work in, what their actual job is. Are they working in sales or are they working as a frontline worker? Communication is going to be very different for those two groups of users. So having a conversation around communication opens up a vast number of different sub-conversations. Productivity is often something that people come together and say, actually, we want to increase productivity. And, where we're working together, we might be working as a team and saying, how do we measure productivity as a team? But actually, productivity could be sales productivity. It could be productivity of building widgets. It could be productivity in a contact center in terms of responding to queries that come in. So there's lots of different ways that actually we can look at some of these words and then say, well, what do you mean by productivity? Do you mean being able to actually focus, being able to actually get your job done, being able to say that actually you've got productive meetings, meetings that are actually going to be effective and you're going to have outcomes rather than long meetings with lots of people where nothing is productive comes out of them. So some of these terms, they're great just to put up and go, what do you actually mean by this? What does this mean to you in your role? And what does this mean in your organization to your employees? When we look at usage and adoption, it's very easy as technologists to go, okay, well, we'll implement this technology. It's going to be fantastic. Everybody should love it. We know that's not the case. Most people actually have a day job and technology is not their day job. So therefore, they're only looking at technology as an enabler for them to do their job. So we need to look at how do we actually ensure they have the capabilities and the understanding of what tools are available to them in order to make their job better. And we need to make sure that we have some way of measuring that adoption. Can we identify the areas in the business who are using tools effectively? And what does that mean for them when they use tools effectively? Can they share those experiences? Can we identify the areas in the business who are not using tools effectively, where they might be able to learn from other areas? You might have two teams who are both working with the same objectives. One team's working really effectively and hitting those objectives. The other team, maybe not so much. So can we look at the way they use tools, the way they're using the technology, and actually identify different behaviors that they can actually share between them? And this is where, we come onto the behavior, how do people use the tools? Are they consistently using those tools or not? I often joke that, behavior is, how do we all respond when somebody sends you a Teams message and says, hello? Behavior is, what do we do about that? Do we actually respond or do we wait for a question? And if we've got common behaviors, then it's easier to actually roll out change. It's easier to roll out new tools because we understand what our expected behavior changes would be to actually incorporate those tools into the way that we work. But also, we can understand that if people are working in common ways, they have similar behaviors, it's easier for them to collaborate with other areas of the business, other people that they haven't directly engaged with before, because they have common understandings of how they use tools. So when we're looking at the employee experience all up, all of these areas are great ways to kind of start that conversation of, well, what does your employee experience feel like? What is the experience that your employees go through daily to actually achieve the tasks that they need to do? So starting the conversation, planting the seeds without actually necessarily understanding where it's going to lead to is really important for us, so that we can really understand where those pain points are, where the opportunities are to improve the way employees work together. So what are clients expecting us to talk about? This is a really interesting challenge because we get a lot of clients that come to us. Well, we get a lot of sales teams that come to us and say, actually, can you talk to a client about Viva? And my first question is always, well, which part of it? What aspect of it are you actually talking about? It's not a single conversation just to go, let's talk about Viva, because if you think about all the different elements, they all relate in different ways and to greater or lesser extents to different roles in the organization. So when we come to the conversation and we say, well, what are we actually going to cover in these sessions? We always try and tie it down so that we can map together, what are clients expecting? Where are they starting from? What's their understanding? Through to, well, what are sales teams trying to actually get us to help them with? And you've got to remember that, Microsoft is all up in the UK, at least, a sales organization. We are trying to help clients understand how they can make the most of the technology. So when we talk about what we cover, we really kind of go back to, you know, removing the product bingo. Let's talk about connection. Let's talk about insight, growth, and purpose. Let's think of it as high level conversation starters. So connection, how do we communicate? How do we make sure that we can communicate better? Better is a relative term. So, where are you starting from? What's your benchmark in terms of communication? Um, you know, do we want to consolidate communication tools? The common question of what to use when has been around for a long time in many different areas, and communication and connection it's not immune to that conversation of what do I use when. When do I publish a news article on SharePoint? How does that get consumed into Viva Connections? How do I make sure it goes to the right audience? How do I make sure that actually we know that the right audience are reading it? How do they feed back? How can they have a discussion around it? How can they share their gripes, their concerns? All of these kind of come into that connection. How do we connect all of our staff within the organization to make sure that they actually can work together, and that we can communicate effectively? Insight. Over the last couple of years, we've had a lot of conversations around spaces. Do we want to know how our spaces are being used? That really informs us as to how much hybrid working do we have? How much are people working just remotely or in person? How are they engaging? What are their habits? What are their behaviors? Are they starting work early? Are they working long hours? Are they getting time to really concentrate on things? So we want to know about that. We want insights into that. Too many meetings. I think, we all probably suffer from too many meetings. And yeah, it's often a question of what does that term meeting and actually mean? Does that mean everything that we are scheduling? Absolutely. Everything is scheduled, shows up as a meeting. But then how much did we used to do before we worked remotely that was more ad hoc, that was less formal, and how do we get back to that? So this is really where, when we think about behaviors, meeting behaviors, yes, I'm just going to schedule in everything that I'm doing is one thing, but actually we really want to know, is that behavior working well? Is it not working well? How can we adapt those behaviors in order to actually for teams to be more productive, for them to work together more effectively? And we want to know which capabilities are being used. Do we have a big uptake in particular capabilities in different areas of an organization? A lot of the organizations I work with are global, and they often see different patterns emerging in different regions. Some culturally, some areas will focus more on in person and less on remote. Other times it's different. So, and when you're working in a global organization, time zones kind of skew a bit around, when people are working. So we want to know if people are all working the same way. Are they using the same tools? Do they use the same capabilities to actually learn, or are they using different tools? Do they have different systems and technology in place in different areas. So how do we know what's being used in order for us to kind of change that behavior and potentially consolidate things back into a common way of working? That what to use when question under growth, it really is the bane of most employees' experience when they come to, okay, where do I save a document? What do I use if I have a question that I want to ask somebody? Do I know who's going to answer me? If I do, that's one thing. Do I use, just a direct message, or do I ask it in a more open forum? How do I know it is the right answer? How do I trust it? How do I find information without necessarily wanting to ask a person? So that what to use when, there are so many ways that we can focus in on what to use when and really help employees understand that the answer to that question. If I want to communicate, what do I use? If I want to collaborate, what do I use? If I want to run a meeting, what do I use? These are really key things that simplify the experience for employees. And when it comes to employee experience, simplification is really key for all of this. When we look at purpose, if we need to get more people into the office, how do we do that? We want to have a transparent direction of travel. How do we know that we're all pulling in the same direction? How do we know that we're all working towards the same objectives, that we're all aligned on our priorities? It's very easy for us to get hung up on, well, I have to do this because this is my targets, whereas you have to do something else because of your targets. We may actually not be completely aligned. We may actually have conflicting interpretations of our targets. So if we can actually share that at a more holistic level as an organization and make sure that we are all pulling together, that really helps everybody kind of align to, well, actually, I can help you to do that because that helps me. And that really builds much more of a solid teamwork, a solid base of collaboration to build on. And we have other things that we might want to do, that are somewhat more existential than our day jobs. We want to be more sustainable. How do we do that? Does that mean we work remotely all the time and never go into the office? Does that mean we change the tools that we're using? Does that mean we change, our activities in some way, our behaviors in other ways? So thinking about these things in terms of what our organization has in terms of strategic direction is really important so that we can actually bed that into everyday activities, everyday experiences, everyday decisions and prioritizations that all of our employees are making. So when we answer the question of, what do we have to cover? What do we have to talk about? Again, there's not really one area. It really depends on where the priorities are for a particular organization. So your organization may have particular challenges here, particular things that are more important are going to have a bigger impact. And it may have things like the sustainability piece that you want to be demonstrating externally that you are a more conscientious organization. Inclusion, diversity, accessibility, all of these things are things that aren't necessarily tangible specifics for what we're doing day to day, but they should be baked into our expectations day to day. So we need to be thinking about this at really quite a holistic level to say, where are the biggest impacts? What is the immediate need that our organization has? And how do we kind of roll that into what we're doing, and the conversations that we're having? If we address the biggest impacts, then we can start to move on to the others. But thinking about all of these in terms of how do we actually really start the conversation with the conversation that has the most resonance, the most impact for the people that we're talking to. And when we think about who's really important, we need to speak to the right people about the right subject. And if we don't do that, then people won't be interested. If I speak to, IT about HR processes, that's not necessarily the right people to speak to. They can't necessarily change that. And if I speak to HR about, how do they, provision security, again, it's not necessarily the right audience that I'm speaking to. Now, if I get both those groups in the same room, I can have those conversations much more effectively because I can get the business requirements and I can get the tooling and the capability requirements and any constraints that might be there and actually get those all out on the table and have the conversation that will really help shape a common agenda, a common perspective on what they're trying to do. And when we talk about employee experience, it is a combination. We can't do, you know, one conversation just about IT without thinking about adoption. We can't do adoption without thinking about, well, what is the change that we're actually implementing? What is the impact from an IT change? Or what is the right business process that we're actually supporting? So we need to think about who very, very carefully. Um, and when we're doing this within the MTC, we really kind of start with, well, who's the main contact that we have? Who's the main stakeholder? But then who else is going to be able to contribute and broaden that conversation in order to get more depth of understanding, but also get more consensus around prioritization. How do we help move forward from that workshop that we might run, that session that we might have? So we will often start with IT, but we will often move out of IT quite quickly. And often the conversation that we have when we do what we call a scoping call for our workshops is to open that conversation up to say, actually, it really helps when we have X, Y, and Z in the room, as well as you. So we really do think about, we know clients will come to us with an expectation, and we do often change that expectation when we have those scoping calls. So who should we be speaking to? When we're talking about employees, it's a wide range of people that we might be speaking to. A chief executive, what are the strategic objectives that they are trying to achieve, and how do we get employees to pull together to achieve that? Chief people officer, HR, those are really common areas because they really do focus in on the employee experience, and they're focusing in on the employee factors. How do we maintain our retention of employees? How do we attract talent? How do we make sure that people are working effectively? How do we, do those pulse surveys and really kind of get the pulse of the organization in terms of, are people happy? Are people productive? Do people support what we're doing? Do they have buy-in for the organization? So we're really looking at those as the really key drivers. But then we need to look at, as we kind of go through from, well, what are the strategic objectives, to how do we actually roll some of these changes out? How do we actually implement change within an organization? We're then looking at lots of different stakeholders here. So, growth and adoption, we might have people who are just focusing on adoption. We might have growth officers. Learning, there might be HR as part of that. There might be a dedicated learning team within HR. So who is involved in that? Who dictates what people need to be aware of, how they gain their knowledge, how do they learn? Actually, security might be playing a part in that. Compliance would play a part in that. How do we actually make sure that we've got the right program of learning going out? And how do we make sure that we've got the right people in the room who can actually speak to the fact that they may actually have a learning management system in place, or they may not, and they may be looking at how do they transform from no tooling in place to actually, increase the level of compliance around learning, job-based learning, skill sets that people need. How do they identify those? We often talk to, heads of workplace, where we see people who are really focusing in on, the collaborative side of working. How do we look at the devices that people are using, the way they engage with those devices? How do we look at communication? That's dedicated teams usually to say, actually, they are pushing information out. But then they may also be looking at, well, how do we communicate internally? And those workplace teams will often have a big play in that. How do we use Teams? How do we use meetings? How do we decide when we go from Teams to Viva Engage? What are the rules of engagement that we're actually putting in place? How do we get Ask Me Anythings into these tools? How do we get town halls in? How do we get feedback in so that, the CEO can be asked questions? So we're looking at a lot of different engagement with different people in here. Head of transformation is a role that we see more and more. We'll often talk to finance, and we'll talk to finance both from a, yes, they want to spend money or not, as the case may be, but actually they have needs in terms of how do they secure things, how do they engage, how do people ask them questions. Finance is often one of those areas of a business that will have the most internal questions coming to them. So they need to be able to use these tools to actually share information, to help people find that information, to be able to engage appropriately with the organization to give them information that they need to actually have. Security will often be a big player in this in terms of, well, okay, how do we make sure that these tools are available to people? How are they signing in? How do we make sure that they have access to the tools that they need access to, but not everything in the organization? So we will often have, those conversations around security. And when we start to look at data as well, security will come into that. How do we secure this data? How do we ensure that we are respecting people's privacy? If you are a global organization and you've got workers' councils, for example, how do we have that conversation around privacy that makes your employees actually confident that you're not misusing data that's being captured? So having those conversations is really important. Property is an interesting one. We see more and more conversations of trying to establish a baseline around behavior of buildings. How do we identify who's in the building? Are they often in the building? Do they sit at the same desk? Where do people in the same departments and teams sit when they come in? You know, how many hot desks do we need? How many meeting rooms do we need? What capabilities do we need in those meeting rooms? So property is an interesting one because they historically maybe haven't been as directly involved in how that employee experience works, but actually they have a lot of data that's really valuable when you look at, okay, if we want to manage behavior, we have physical behavior as well as digital behavior. And we need to kind of be able to crunch those together in order to get more of a holistic view of what does good behavior look like? How do we actually make sure that we've got the right people in the room to have that conversation? Well, property, HR, data, they will all be really good to have that conversation, to have a single view of this is how people are using our spaces, our physical spaces, and our digital tools. So data is really important there. How do we actually crunch this data? And importantly, if we're capturing data, we want to know how do we share it back out into the organization. How do we use things like Viva Insights, the advanced insights, and actually make use of that information to make decisions? And do we surface it back out over and above the native capabilities, or do we actually match it up with other information? How do we bring in our HR system? How do we bring data together from goals and from our HR KPIs that we may already be using? So we're looking at all of these different areas as key stakeholders that we want to potentially have in the room. And this will always go back to what are we talking about? What are we trying to achieve? What are the outcomes that we need to achieve? Um, but this will often be a conversation where, when we speak to our clients, they will look at us and go, oh, we'd never thought about bringing them into the room to have this conversation. But we really understand why you're suggesting this, because they do have all of this other insight or these other perspectives around what we're trying to achieve here. So key to this isn't a conversation about IT. It's about transformation and people. And it's in the name, employee experience. It's about employees and how do we actually change their experience and make it better. But all of these stakeholders will have a stake in that because they all contribute to the culture that is in your organization, to the way people collaborate, the way they interact, the way they use the tools that they've got, the way they use the space that your organization provides. So we want to make sure that we're bringing all of these people into this conversation. And we will often get some interesting conflicts in terms of different agendas, different perspectives in this. But actually, what we want to do is to actually bring those to the surface and actually make sure that we've got those differing agendas um, on the surface, because that way we can help prioritize and have a consensus, a shared prioritization about what's going to be most impactful for employees. And that conversation about impact for employees is often one that's quite a difficult one, because it means that some of these areas of the business might actually have to make some compromises in order to put employees ahead of maybe some of their other objectives that they're working towards in their own departments. So what do we talk about when we're having these conversations? So I've kind of given a few conversation starters, but when we're thinking about this, there's a few different ways that we can kind of give more focus to these conversations. So, staying informed, rather than just talking about communication, if it's staying informed, then we might want to bring in, some key kind of features and really frame it that way, so that we're talking about how do employees stay informed. We might be talking about growth mindset. How do they actually learn? How do they drive themselves? How do they actually, stay on top of what they have to do as a mandatory set of activities, but actually, how do they push themselves further? And that might be learning, but that might be other things like goals that we're pushing in a different way. We might have a shared purpose, goals and sales. How do we really bring people and align people together? Um, how do we look at well-being in terms of insights, but in terms of, what are the risks that well-being actually poses to an organization, in terms of not being able to retain people, if they burn out, if they go long-term sick. It's interesting when we run exercises, and we run a lot of workshops in the MTC, and we'll often do an exercise where, based on these sorts of themes, we'll say, how do you want to measure success here? What does it look like? If in 2 years' time you look back on this, how would you demonstrate success? And well-being is a really interesting one, because we'll often get IT folks looking at, they're using tools, we get less tickets, we get better feedback, but actually HR might look at this as we get less sick days, we get more retention. And those are actually easier to measure in terms of the numbers than some of the more holistic things that we get in terms of how do I measure well-being, or will I get surveys back? So there's some really interesting ways that, if you frame the right question, you can get some really good input into this in terms of how you would drive this internally within an organization. I don't, when we look at monitoring and change, that rollout of change is really hard. If you've identified what change you're going to roll out, it's much easier to then monitor it, to actually look at the adoption, to focus in on how do you actually make sure that people are actually adopting the tools and the technologies that you're giving them. So when we look at all of these, we're trying to tie this down into a little more detail. So stay informed, growth mindset, shared purpose. These are just examples of sessions that we've run where we're focusing in on these different areas. And we're focusing in on particular capabilities. But we really want to be able to tell a story that's going to show benefit around this, and show the impact for an actual user, for an employee. So we will often do a day in the life, and we vary this quite a lot. I've got a session later on about what Viva means to employees. We'll go into more details for this, but this is really looking at, if I think about an abstract day in the life for a user, I might be starting off with, I'm browsing corporate news while grabbing a coffee. I'm preparing for the day. I'm reviewing emails and Teams. If I'm going to look at insights, I want to kind of bring some of this into play. Insights users to do. So I want to bring this into the conversation. How do I look at my day? How do I look at the tasks? How do I create tasks from all those team messages, from emails? How do I actually really make sure that I'm empowering my employees to really stay on top of this, as an individual, but as a team as well? How do they prioritize what they need to do for the day? If it goes into my day, it'll show up in Viva Insights at the end of the day. How do they search for information? It's a big area, this, but searching for information is probably one of the biggest gripes that we've all had for probably as long as we've been working. I can't find it. How do I find it? How do I know what I'm finding is up to date? How do I know it's the most relevant thing? How do I find the right person? How do I ask a question? if I can ask a question, who's going to answer it? Is it going to be my teammates? Is it going to be somebody that I don't know? How do I know it's the right answer? Can I search questions that other people have asked? So, we've got all of these sorts of things that they're not all going to be something that one person is going to do in a single day, but all of these are things that probably over a week everybody is going to do in one way or another, or maybe they should do, but they don't find it's quite so easy. So, reviewing training. We often joke in Microsoft that we're mostly doing training because it's mandatory. But actually, if you can do that review training on your phone in Viva Learning, then you can actually do it when you're on the train into the office. You can do it when you're taking a break somewhere, when you're having a coffee. It really makes it much easier. And these are the sorts of things that this kind of day in the life really kind of helps to highlight from an employee experience. What are we actually allowing people to do? What are we encouraging them to do? And what are we enabling them to do without going to other applications? So all of these experiences are primarily within Teams. Obviously, the email part's not, but we're looking at how do we have that single pane of glass to see everything, which when we're talking about impact on an employee, it just makes it easier. We're not doing that, oh, I need to go over to, my other HR system to do something else. I have to go to my learning system. I have to go to my task management system. We're trying to consolidate into one place, make it easier for people. So we've got personal insights down there, manager insights. When we talk about managers, again, this is a simple day in the life. We might look at more around actually persona-based day in the life. How do I really focus in on a persona? And when we look at all of these, that persona conversation is absolutely key. And the session I'll do later, we'll talk much more around personas. But if you think about all of these activities, these are all focused on the employee experience side, but it's not even everything. We've not really spoken about Viva Sales. Viva Amplify isn't really in there. It's more of a background activity in terms of preparing that news. But we're looking at this as a generic way to spark that conversation and describe the impact that this will have on employees. And when we get the right people in the room and we tailor this to them, we really start to get some really rich conversations as to, well, why are people doing it this way? Oh, I didn't know they do it that way. How do people in this organization or this area of the organization actually do this? So a lot of ways that we can actually really bring some of this to life and really kind of make sure that, again, we're not talking about products, we're talking about the tangible experience that people actually have as employees in your organization when they're being targeted with actually doing work in your organization. And we have to remember, a lot of this conversation is about employees and do they have the time to do all of this as well? When we're looking at that training, it's always an interesting one. How do I have time to do training? Well, actually, it's bedding it in. It's bedding it into, that growth mindset piece. It's bedding it into this is part of the way that we work. This is part of the way that we want people to use the time that they have available. So really thinking about this is a really valuable way to really frame this. And especially when you think about, we're not talking about products, we're not talking to IT specifically. This is equally relevant for a CEO as it is to a frontline worker. This will resonate if you tailor this to them. So if we've managed to start this conversation about Viva and about the capabilities, what do we want as the next steps? What outcomes do we plan for? So this is always really interesting when, depending where an organization is starting from, because they might have already looked at Viva and looked at it one or two of the modules, but not understood all of the modules. But they may also have not really seen anything at all. I always sort of caveat these sessions when I'm planning them internally at work to say, I could probably demo Viva all day, but that's not really what we want. We want the outcomes. We want to know where we're focusing, because actually when we think about it, the things that we want to actually come out of this, we might want a vision. We might want much more thought going into what does that day in the life look like, reimagining the future. And that might bring in other conversations, okay, well, we're using Teams, maybe we're not using it to its fullest extent, and we need to think about how do we do that. We may be looking at, actually, we don't have integration with our HR system, so we can't necessarily roll this out effectively and easily. So thinking about that vision, what's that long-term vision, is really important for us to say, actually, in order to picture that vision, we need to put other things in place. And that will help us prioritize, where is the biggest impact? Who will benefit most? Are there particular personas that will benefit more than others? How can we actually prioritize those personas and those benefits so that the organization can actually realize those quicker? When we're looking at that prioritization, we often look at how can outcomes be demonstrated? How can we start to benchmark where you're starting from in order to then say, and we've implemented Viva modules, right? Can we now demonstrate that there has been a tangible change that has been beneficial? And if so, can we then say, what is the next thing? But also, if not, can we identify why not? Can we target areas of the organization who maybe haven't actually benefited as much as we thought they would and work out why they haven't benefited as much? Planning, so success criteria, what are those measures? What are the things that we really want to focus on? We plan pilot implementations. This isn't a set of tools that you just go, it's one size fits all for everybody. You've got to look at the way people work. So piloting it and then to actually expand that out and actually take lessons on board. That's really valuable for us. But also, when we look at pilots, if you get a team that is maybe more of the magpie mentality, they're not afraid to click on things and they're anxious to try new things and to use new things. Get them to try stuff, get them to experiment, push the boundaries. But also where you've got pilot groups who have a tangible pain point that you are trying to resolve, those are great when you resolve those because they can actually be case studies internally. This is how we've used this. This is how it's changed the way we work. That can really start to build the momentum in terms of what other groups want to do. Similar teams, similar working practices. How can they actually benefit from rolling these tools out as well? And then when you're launching, roll out the easy bits first and then go from there. Adopt, monitor, reinforce, use the change methodologies that are out there in order to actually reinforce that adoption piece and to really kind of bring all of your employees on the journey. Employees who have a day job are least likely to want to actually spend time working on IT if there isn't a clear, tangible outcome for them. So in summary, Viva's not an IT conversation. We don't want to focus in on IT and just talk about switching a product on. This is about a change in culture. So we need to have a wide set of stakeholders to really understand, what is that impact going to be? What are the benefits going to be? And what are the obstacles and the risks that are going to be? So think about the stakeholder group that you're going to engage. Think about where you're going to prioritize the conversation. And present outcomes and benefits, not products. So what is going to be the tangible outcome that you want to see? Is it going to be, that all of a sudden your employees can actually use a mobile device and actually do their mandatory training, elsewhere rather than having to sit in a quiet space and do it? And it's going to free up time because it's going to be easier to do. Is it going to be, more collaboration, better well-being, retention of staff, attraction of staff? There's all sorts of different ways that you can look at the different capabilities of the Viva suite actually presenting back tangible benefits. But they do need the right stakeholders in the room in order for them to be realized. IT won't always recognize all of the tangible benefits that will come from this. So with that, are there any questions? I don't think I saw that many. I saw Sarah online. Train the trainers on the train. Absolutely, Sarah. And Kev said Steve's got a great session later on XLAs. I don't know what time that is, but Kev, I'm sure you can share that.
Yeah, I believe it's two. So it's in about 2 hours' time. It's 2 o'clock UK time, and no way it's those exclusive agreements. And the reason I mentioned that is you were talking about HR do the similar monitoring, and I've been fairly new to XLAs, but I feel it fits that conversation really nicely.
You're breaking up a little bit. I don't know whether that's my end or your end, but I think I got most of that in terms of Steve's session. I've also got 2 sessions later on. So one, 1300 UTC, 2 o'clock UK time, how to configure elevated access to Viva securely with Entra. This is really looking at how do we actually make sure that we've got admin side of things for the most of the Viva components, but also really thinking about Viva insights as well. How do we actually get business leaders enabled so that they can actually see information? We'll talk about how we can automate that, how we can revoke those permissions for changes, movers, levers, etc. And then later on, again, Viva, what does it mean for your employees? So I'll be going into more around the persona mapping for those and the day in the life, and how do we really kind of bring this to life for those conversations and really target the employees so they understand what change in experience they will have. And I think that brings it mostly to the top of the hour.
I think it does. Thank you very much for that. And I've seen some of the comments and comments on you speak on there as well. And I heartily agree on that. Really interesting. I think on such an important subject, because new to Viva potentially a little bit on there. So it's really about how we can help people with that as well. Now, I'm going to let you speak a sec while I try and sort out my connection, which is being hit by kids on half term as well.
I was going to say, and I think, if anybody wants to reach out, ask questions around this, do feel free. The conversations that I have at work around this are always intriguing, and we do go from, starting off with, okay, an HR team into data and analytics, into communication. The conversations meander wildly depending on who's in the room and what their agendas are, what their objectives are. So it's always a great session. And as I say, I would always try and target the audience and make sure you're tailoring your content to the audience. The number of times I've tried to do demos of all of this and just run out of time because the conversations just explode and you just kind of go, right, I did want to get all of this done, but I've got the first 10 minutes done. There's always so much conversation around how this can actually impact people.
I can see Sarah nodding away vigorously in the green room there.
And I think the other thing I would say about this, the other thing that we've at Microsoft where I work, we're quite lucky. We've got the right tools to do this, but if at all, try and demonstrate it on the devices that people are going to be using. So where you're demonstrating, information worker on a screen in PowerPoint, that's fine. But if you've got a mobile device, then try and show it on that mobile device, because that really kind of brings to life the experience. And we're really just trying to promote the experience, the employee experience here. So if I'm looking at it on a kiosk device, I think like Kev was showing up there, I want to show what that experience looks like. If it's frontline workers, tailor it to the devices they're using, the way they use those devices. If it's, personal, talk about how that would work. In terms of the security, how they would sign into it, how they would use it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. I know, Al, you've got to run off and can't join us chatting about goals and purpose, but thank you very much. We'll let you run and we'll see you online a bit later.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Speak later.